off actually with a question for the audience. How many out there have taken a MOOC? That's a pretty good number. How many have finished one?
Surprising.
A few. That's actually, you guys are pretty good students. Yeah, I mean, as you guys know, the MOOC hype has died down a bit, and one of the reasons has been the completion rate, the very low completion rate, often around like 7% for these first kind of wave of these massive open online courses that, you know, you guys read, whether even people outside of the education, you know, you couldn't miss it. It was this, the New York Times called it a tsunami. It was the year of the MOOC and all this stuff, and now, you know, then there was this a little bit disillusionment. But actually, quietly, since that kind of early low completion days, people have rethought that a little bit and said, like, well, why? You know, why was that low? And one reason is that I think that, you know, as you guys all know, if you maybe didn't finish the MOOC, it was because they were often one-offs that were sort of a bit random, and the motivation by students was not necessarily as strong. And so the question that's come across is, well, maybe one answer to that is trying to get something that you might want to show as a student, to show to an employer, or to have something more than just a kind of one little course that's kind of off on an island. And so in the meantime, there have been many iterations on MOOCs and online courses of different types. And now we're actually seeing this new generation of thing called Microcredentials, or they're Nanodegrees. There's a lot of different brand names for it, but the essence of it is, what if you did have something that you could then motivate students to finish? And the completion rates in those actually have gone up. So I think people are now talking, even though that hype has died down, there's kind of a sense that maybe there is going to be a game-changing thing happening around microcredentials. And so that's what this panel is going to school us on the latest in. We've got a great, some great thought leaders up here. Let me just first, just very briefly, as our host said, we're not going to go deeply into bios, but I'm Jeff Young, an editor at the Chronicle, and also I did write an ebook called Beyond the MOOC Hype, so trying to understand all of this. And we have an awesome panel here, like I said. Ryan Craig, who is the managing director of University Ventures, author of a great book called College Disrupted, The Great Unbundling of Higher Education. Melissa Loble, vice president of partners and programs for Instructure, and which this is the maker of Canvas, but also a MOOC network. Mike Buttry from Capella University, vice president of public affairs there, an online university, so we'll a different perspective there. And Jonathan Finkelstein from Credly, the CEO of Credly, which is a platform for displaying these new microcredentials and doing what we talked about of, you know, getting that to the employer as some sort of you know, badge that you're proud to show. So I'm going to direct a conversation. As you know, this is a jam-packed program. We don't have a lot of time, but I'm going to try to just direct some questions to get us started. And I wanted to start with Ryan. So I guess the one question is, you're somebody watching this space, you know, being a venture investor and an author. What is your crystal ball prediction? You know, how big can these tiny credentials get? And will it go beyond the tech fields that maybe are a natural fit for this kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, no, we think very clearly that it's the future of higher education, that the current system that we have, this degree-based system, if you think about it, degrees are the currency that we use in higher education. It's the currency of the workforce as well. And we use it because it's the best we have. Right now. Employers use it as a screening mechanism. They don't look at candidates who don't have degrees, but the degrees really determine how good a candidate is, whether they're qualified for a job. A lot of employers are determining that the answer is no. Ernst & Young, for example, in the UK, thinks that degrees are misleading and actually now is masking degrees, hiding them from their hiring managers and using assessments, and Google is doing that as well. And so forth. And so we foresee a world, and the timing is unclear, as I say in my book, of competency marketplaces where the currency becomes the competency. And that competency could be determined in a number of different ways, taxonomies and whatnot. We think it'll be determined by algorithms and competency marketplaces like LinkedIn that will essentially profile your competencies and determine whether you're qualified for a position, and provide a much better filter for employers than the degree-based filter or the keyword-based filter they're currently using on resumes today.
That's great. I hadn't heard the actual hiding the institution that they went to. That's an extreme where you're really saying, like, don't go with a bias toward fancy you or unknown you. So I guess the other thing that's obvious here is kind of what do these look like, right? Because it's easy to get abstract with microcredentials. So I guess, Jonathan, I was curious, from your seat at Credly, how does it work? Like, what are students getting with these, and what are they showing, and how does it kind of function?
Sure. I think it's really easy to think about them as a portable and digital version of what might have been a paper certificate at one time. And by being portable and digital, it confers on it a lot of extra bonus features that make it a lot more valuable as the currency that Ryan mentioned. So what does it look like? It's a set of data that can be used in lots of different, both human readable ways, where you can actually see a certificate kind of view and show it to people and put it on your fridge. But you can also share it on professional networks and have these credentials absorbed or consumed by environments and communities and places that would value them. And they can do so in a more secure way, in a way that carries the evidence both of the accomplishment or the skill, but also the validity of who the issuing group or institution was. I think it's important. We think of these things as verifiable claims of learning or of skills versus, which is really what credentials have always been. We've thought of credentials as having three parties, an issuer, an earner, and somebody who cares about the skill that this claim is validating. So we're talking about skills at any level that are verifiable claims of somebody's learning.
So obviously, all of us probably know exactly where the diploma we got as an undergraduate is, and we could pull that up at any moment and show it off. I mean, this is different than a traditional diploma. I guess my point being that often we don't know, and there's never actually a show to an employer the actual certificate. So this is something.
Or the transcript.
Or the transcript.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in a way, this is, somebody mentioned, John Katzman mentioned this sort of, is it just replicating what's been going on in the past? There's something a little different, right, when you take what's going on with microcredentials.
It's very different. In most cases, your skill sets, if they are validated or verified at all, are usually locked up in somebody's safe where you don't get any access to it unless you ask nicely. And then when you get it, you find it's outdated. It represents something you did years ago. It has a course level, a course title, which means nothing to anyone. You'd be hard-pressed to remember anything you actually did in that course. And it loses its timeliness and its value to you very, very, very quickly, to the point where folks like Ernst & Young are dismissing them outright. So what we're talking about is doing this throughout our lives in a way where every time you have a skill, it can be verified. It belongs to you. You decide when and where and how you want to have it represent you in the world. And groups who are in a position to assess your learning and your skills make it part of their everyday work as they are observing you doing things of value to put their stamp of approval on you and let you take that with you.
So Melissa, so I didn't mention this in your intro, but not only are you with Instructure, which runs a MOOC network, but you've taught a MOOC.
Mm-hmm, I have.
So I'm curious from those seats, who are the students here, and kind of what are motivating them to get into these microcredentials?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I've taught a MOOC 4 times now, and and I taught it when MOOCs first emerged.
Those early ones.
The early ones, and the student has changed actually dramatically. So I've watched it. The early ones, I think, were very educated participants interested in what is this MOOC thing. You mentioned how the courses were sort of random, abstract, not applicable necessarily to your professional career. And I've seen that, and I happen to teach a course that's more about developing your professional career. And I've seen the student change, and now they're hungry for, how can I make an impact in my job today? How can I use this in order to improve my skills to be able to develop myself? And I think that goes along with what John was talking about this morning, in that while transformation's happening with the system, because of what MOOCs are doing, I think transformation's also happening in how we teach and what we're doing because of what MOOCs have been doing.
Are the students more motivated and completing in a more?
Interestingly enough, I think they've redefined what the term completion is for themselves. So for themselves, right? So it's no longer
good. Move
I
the
need that.
goalpost, yeah.
That's right. I don't need that. You know, they want the certificate, but they also they want the badge in a micro sense. They want to go learn that one thing or those two things. They don't want to represent 10 weeks of American history
Right.
and then have that not necessarily be applicable or relevant to themselves.
Are you a dropout, or are you just a really savvy consumer?
Exactly. Well, see, no, I think that's what it is. I think it's that savvy consumer. Let me pick the nugget
Right.
out of your
That's
course
funny.
I
So
need.
we're unbundling beyond the degree. Now we're unbundling the MOOC.
In a lot of ways, I think so.
Well, Mike, now you're at an online university and at Capella. I guess I'm curious to think about how this might change the existing higher education as we know it. You know, this has implications, right, for if these things start to catch on as people up here are saying.
Yeah, so I would start by saying the diploma doesn't have to be the way that it's been for the last however many hundred years, right?
Colleges don't have to just give
It doesn't have to be an
diplomas, yeah.
artifact of the 20th century. I mean, you can compose a degree of competencies
Right.
and display those to the person who's investing in that degree in a way that they can present them to their employers. And in doing that, what you begin to do is get at some of what John talked about, of the disconnect between cost and value in the degree, right? As the employer is able to effectively value the currency of the competency, you create the conditions where you can bring cost and value more into alignment, where I don't think today there's much at all.
We call that the double-click degree, where you can literally double-click on the degree and see the competencies behind it. Some traditional universities are working on that. Capella is ahead of most because it has its FlexPath competency-based program.
Anya Chemnitz did a great piece in the New York Times a couple of years ago talking about how you can visualize this for consumers.
I'm curious, actually, to all of you. John Katzman mentioned that, you know, just offhand in one of the Q&As, that the master's degree, professional master's degrees, are just going to go away.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big dismissal of a big part of higher education. In some cases, it helps colleges. It's like a loss leader to help them, you know, in other ways. So, what do you think of that claim? Is it going to go that far?
Yeah. So
any of you, actually? Yeah.
I don't agree, but there's truth underneath what he said, right? So there are employment end markets where the masters and the PhD are going to remain ingrained for a long time.
You need that piece of paper,
right? And then there are other employment end markets where the masters has become, like John said, relatively meaningless and over bundled, and I think it's going to depend on the employment vertical and an institution's ability to respond to that challenge and make the masters meaningful in a way that the employer gives it value.
Goes back to colleges have to change, so they're not just going to be able to stay the same.
Yeah, I would agree with that. In fact, the MOOC that I teach is exactly that. I teach a MOOC that's in a certificate series related to instructional design. And that's something that in past people went and got masters of instructional design. And we're seeing the enrollments in those programs go down significantly. People aren't interested in that. They want to pick and choose their courses and create that experience so they can go get that job without that degree.
I think, you know, the degree remains the default currency of the labor market today because it's still the strongest signal that employers receive relative to on the competencies of candidates.
It's a vetting process.
Right, exactly. So when the signal that employers begin to receive from, you know, a competency-based currency, for example, a Credly profile of an individual becomes a stronger signal for employers than the signal they're getting from degrees, this will all flip. And then degrees will go away. And it doesn't matter whether it's doctoral, master's, bachelor's, or associate's degrees. They go away because you don't need to have that bundle. It's an arbitrary bundle at that point.
There are licensure path careers where they are packed with regulatory inertia and impediment that will continue to teach nursing, teaching, counseling, that will continue to value the degree. They'll be kind of at the tail end of disruption.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned Anya Chemnitz, and she wrote a book many years ago called DIYU. But we haven't actually, and certainly no knock to her book, it's quite good, but we haven't quite seen that emerge, right? We haven't seen, at least, other than a few anecdotes, which are very fun to write about and read about, but, you know, a student kind of foregoing college because they can, you know, cobble together something amazing with, you know, a mentor here and a micro degree there. So at the undergraduate level, how much do you see change possible? Or is it really something else where it's more for the upskilling, someone I think said in the Q&A, in the first session. Is it going to be more of this kind of online learning, continual learn as you go as a grown-up once you leave higher ed, and once you leave four-year traditional BA, and so it's not really going to disrupt so much the first college experience, or is it going to also disrupt what many of us had, this four-year residential experience?
As an employer, I can say that we're seeing an upswing of job applications from people since we took our requirement of a bachelor's degree off. And we're getting, as submissions, people's GitHub profiles.
Applying to work for Credly.
Yes, exactly. We're getting people submitting their sample projects, their code base. If they're engineers, we're getting people submitting their press releases and their social media work. That's what I look for when I'm hiring anyway. And I can't be alone in this. I know we're not. So at the same time, there may be some rebundling of some of the degrees, even as they unbundle. For example, take a group like Deakin University in Australia, which is trying to get back to what a master's degree used to mean, which is you've been out in the workplace, you've demonstrated and have cultivated some real-world skills, and now you're looking for someone to validate them, those verifiable claims I mentioned earlier, so that somebody else doesn't have to do the hard work, as John Katzman said earlier, of doing the assessment. If you can take someone else's word for it, that saves everyone a lot of time. And so sometimes that can be, in the case of Deakin University, you take miniature assessments in particular topics that would map to master's level skills in IT, and when you complete, if you choose to complete all 16 of them, you can get an actual master's degree for having done that. It's optional. You can just do the 5 skills you think the employers that are seeking you would be looking for, or you can do all of them if the market and employment market is requiring that master's level.
Right, I couldn't agree more. I mean, as wearing my investor hat, when someone asks me the question, is someone going to do the hard work? The answer is almost always no. They're not going to do the hard work. Students are not going to do DIY. Employers are not going to take the time to try to figure out what is this alphabet soup of things this candidate
It doesn't
brings.
do that signaling.
It's not a clear signal. It has to be a high fidelity signal. And so I think the Credly platform is a really interesting one because it's one place where all the competencies can sit and be clear. LinkedIn, I believe, will become a competency marketplace where that is, and I think they're heading in that direction very, very clearly as well. But only in IT, I think, will employers you can look at GitHub, right? It's not a lot of work. You can look at GitHub, you can see the code, you can see the work they've done, and you can say, okay, we don't need the degree. But in other fields, I think they're not going to do the work until the signals are of a higher fidelity.
Mikey, do you want to jump in here?
Well, sure. I mean, the only thing I would add is I think that the world is different for an 18 to 22-year-old in terms of DIYU versus an adult trying to figure out what the most direct path is to learning in employment or learning and advancing in employment. Right. I think that adult is going to have an increasing market of options.
Huh. So, I started mentioning MOOCs, and I'm curious, what do you take away from the MOOC kind of hype and disillusionment in the public mind, right? I know that you guys are more on the inside, so you might have a different view of it than people just reading the New York Times or whatever. I guess, Melissa,
Sure.
what does it all mean? Like, what does this? Are there going to be MOOCs? Or somebody asked me actually out in the audience before the session, are those still? Are universities backing out of MOOCs now? Is that still happening?
Yeah, so part of what I do is we run a MOOC platform for Instructure, and we're seeing the same interest from universities into continuing to offer MOOCs.
Right.
But I think what's unique is because, in our situation, is because we're not looking for a business model. So I worry about, will MOOCs still exist? Because a lot of the other platforms have to have a business model behind them.
Sure.
And they've struggled finding those, right? Is it a certificate? Is it a badge? What is it? They don't know.
And for many of you guys know this, I'm sure, it's like they're free unless you want a certificate or a badge. And so the certificates or the badges pay the bills.
Exactly, and they're actually really pushing, the platforms are pushing very hard. I teach on one of those platforms to not offer something for free, to really convince your students to want to purchase that certificate, really have an upsell involved in that. And so I wonder if that will drive MOOCs away, while universities will still find ways to find technologies and platforms and be creative about how to offer MOOCs, or what I like to call open online education, and still support this movement. But I think the MOOC itself will go away.
Yeah, MOOC is a silly misnomer.
Yeah.
Because the massive and open part of it are superfluous. Mm-hmm. Who cares if it's? In fact, if it's massive, why is that a good thing in terms of higher education, which has always prided itself on being, the opposite.
Yep.
One
massive
teacher for 100,000
and
students
open.
is not a selling point.
Right. No. And in terms of open, those models that are actually getting traction are not open. They're essentially online courses, and so MOOCs basically are only important insofar as it became the moment when online courses or online education became not only acceptable but a requirement for all institutions.
So it changed the view of the sort of reputation of online education.
Right.
Yeah. I would say, I mean, this is the MOOC movement, or whatever you want to call it, is a consequence of digitization, right? I mean, the content today is ubiquitous and open and available, and MOOCs are a way to receive that content and instruction. So I don't think institutions should overread that, but at the same time, if you're going to compete in the future, you have to accommodate for the massive availability of content and figure out how to deal with that.
Right. So, I mean, the pace of change is going to increase at colleges by the.
I mean, so yeah, I would say. I mean, I think that the business model is for a lot of institutions, not all.
Right.
For a lot of institutions, the business model is under intense pressure, and that is going to accelerate the pace of change. There are large obstacles of inertia for a lot of these institutions. But I think you'll find them quickly being moved as business imperatives kind of clarify the mind. So I think that's a long, convoluted way of saying yes. The pace will increase.
Yes.
I think the pace of change will increase in how we teach too, because what the MOOCs did is it gave students a voice for very, very vocally saying what's good and what's bad about learning. And it's taught them to be a consumer in a way that I think they haven't been in the past. And so I think that will continue to encourage change in what's happening in the classroom too.
Yeah, I think the pressure is already intense in terms of enrollment and students beginning to focus more and more on ROI, but we still haven't seen the first students come through the door to say, look, my Credly profile, here's my set of competencies on Credly today.
Sure.
How does your, I read your programs of study, your biology, your bachelor's degree in biology looks terrific, but how is it going to help me take my profile from here to where it needs to be in order to qualify for, the career I want? And universities who can't answer that question are going to find their enrollment falling faster than it's falling today.
I'm not happy. No, I actually, do we have time for one or two questions? I will give the mic. Oh, good. There's one hand over here. The folks with the mics will come around, so bear with me. Just let me stall for a second. The first questioner has the mic, and we'll just have time for one or two.
Hi, I went to the keynote for YouTube yesterday, and I'm half tempted to take my kids out of school and sit them in front of YouTube and maybe just create their own career for being a YouTube star. I just wonder, a lot of the comments seem to come from the fact that we still think that universities are the place that we need to be. Maybe in the future that kids don't need to go for recruitment, they just go on YouTube and they create their own career for themselves and learn through, peer-to-peer, that sort of thing. So what are your thoughts about that and, as a place for online learning?
I disagree with that. I think that, there have always been opportunities for autodidacts to learn. Correspondence education has been around for centuries. The percentage of the population that actually will benefit from that, I don't think has increased. So what quality online education, like what what Capella does, is very different from a YouTube, video.
I would just add one thing to that, which is, and this goes back to the question that was asked of John earlier of non-cognitive or soft skills and the harder skills. We're seeing a lot of digital credentials on our platform that are being used for the kinds of things that would be very difficult for someone to have verified in an independent study kind of model, as well as all of the hard skills and ones that are. Things like collaboration and critical thinking in groups, the ability to give and deliver presentations in different kinds of contexts, from the boardroom to the classroom and elsewhere. And I think when you think about, if any of you are employers, if you think about what you look for, the skills are the easy part. The hard part is figuring out whether the person is going to be an active learner and not be the same person you hired a few months or a few years from now. And that has a lot to do with how they interact with people, how they learn, not necessarily what they learn.
All right, let's get one more question.
We have one
in.
more question here. I will ask our next group of panelists, if you could, please step on behind the stage and get mic'd up so we're ready to go. Go ahead, Miss. Thanks.
My name is Tacey Trowbridge. I'm with Adobe, and I'm really interested in the way in which industry and employers are facing this change as well. What are the kinds of things and trends that you're seeing in terms of industry acceptance of competency, of Credly badges? Just interested in hearing more about that.
That's a great question.
Really quickly, we're seeing a growing number of employers acting as what traditionally the credentialing institutions, higher education institutions were doing, which is they realize that if they certify their own workforce, I mean, we spend more of our time on the job than we do in a classroom, in fact, throughout our lives by far. And so who better to assess our learning and our training in addition to provide that training than our employer? So we're seeing large insurance companies, IT companies, groups like Time Warner Cable, the Verizon Foundation sponsoring and being part of workforce development initiatives that I think will create a baseline of currently employed people with credentials issued by their own companies and a growing willingness to allow those to be portable outside the company, because what goes out the door will hopefully come back in the door if other companies. I think there's definitely a need for industries to coordinate and collaborate on this. I think it's in everyone's benefit.
Yeah, I could talk about this for hours, and I know we have like 30 seconds. But there's huge variance between employment and markets, but you are starting to see some become very, very sophisticated about the competencies that they require and need, and how to assess them, and what they'll give currency to, primarily, obviously IT, but also the analytics space, and you're starting to see it in healthcare. Really sophisticated healthcare companies.
Well, I think we are out of time. I want to just help me thank the panelists here for their thoughts. Thank you.